My wedding was never going to happen. I knew at the instant my phone buzzed at 6 in the morning, vibrating with a text from my fiancé's ex-boyfriend. It was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, a certainty that swallowed the last vestiges of sleep. The message was simple: "Thanks for last night, Chloe," followed by a little heart emoji. And I was lying right there, next to Chloe, in our bed, in my house, wondering what in the actual hell I'd missed while I was asleep. I'm Michael. I'm 33. An architect. And for the past year, I'd been living in what felt like the most polite, insidious psychological nightmare of my life. Chloe and I had been together for 5 years, engaged for 12 months. From the outside, our relationship looked perfect, picture book perfect, except for one glaring detail that everyone, and I mean everyone, kept telling me was totally normal, and that I was crazy for having a problem with. Her ex-boyfriend, Noah, was still very much in her life. And when I say in her life, I don't mean they'd text once a month or grab coffee twice a year. No, this guy was at every holiday dinner, every birthday party, every family gathering. He even had a key to her parents' house, for crying out loud. That morning, when I showed Chloe the text, she barely glanced at it. Just brushed it off, a casual, "Oh, we went to that new wine bar in Midtown last night." I mentioned it. I stood there, feeling like such an idiot, racking my brain, trying to remember if she had told me. Was I losing my mind? This had become our pattern. Noah was always just there, a shadow hovering at the edge of every plan we made. And whenever I brought it up, I was the problem. Chloe would use words like evolved and emotionally mature and secure attachment style. And her parents, Brenda and Arthur, both former therapists, would back her up. Brenda would talk about me needing to examine my insecurity and unpack my outdated masculinity. I'm not kidding, she actually said that to me at Thanksgiving once, right after Noah helped himself to seconds of the turkey I had brought. Arthur would just nod along, like I was a particularly interesting case study. I felt less like a fiancé and more like a patient they were all analyzing. The thing is, I'm not a jealous guy. I've never been controlling. My ex-girlfriends and I parted on good terms. I genuinely didn't care if Chloe had male friends. But Noah wasn't just a friend. He was everywhere. And every boundary I tried to set was treated like a personal failing, something I needed to work through in therapy. Chloe's parents had this way of making every conversation feel like an intervention where I was the one with the problem that needed fixing. After a while, I started to doubt myself. Have you ever been in a situation where everyone around you insists you're wrong, and you start believing them, even though your gut is screaming otherwise? My own parents, David and Susan, didn't say much when I mentioned it at family dinners. But I'd catch my mom's face sometimes, this tight expression, like she was biting back words. And my dad would just squeeze my shoulder, then change the subject. They're not confrontational people. They didn't want to interfere, but I could feel their concern, like a weight in the room. Meanwhile, at Chloe's family events, Noah would be sitting right there at the main table. Not off with the extended family or casual friends, but with us, the core group. And everyone acted like this was completely normal. He'd been her boyfriend for 3 years before me. They'd broken up mutually, according to Chloe, stayed friends, and her parents loved him so much they'd basically adopted him as a bonus son. I'd watch him laugh at inside jokes with Arthur, help Brenda in the kitchen, play with Chloe's younger sister's kids, and I'd just think, am I insane, or is this utterly bizarre? Chloe would catch me looking, and later tell me I seemed tense, ask if I was feeling insecure again. And I'd end up apologizing. The gaslighting was so smooth, so polished, I didn't even recognize it as gaslighting until way too late. It was all dressed up in therapy language and concern for my emotional growth. And I fell for it, because I wanted to be a good partner. I wanted to be evolved and mature and secure, so I swallowed my discomfort over and over, and Noah kept showing up. He was at her birthday dinner, 2 seats down from me. He was on the family vacation to the cabin in the Smoky Mountains, sleeping in the guest room, while I shared Chloe's childhood bedroom. He was at Christmas, opening presents with the family, while I smiled and pretended this was fine. Every time I tried to talk to Chloe about it privately, she'd flip it back on me, asking why I was so threatened by her friendship, or saying it was really about my own issues with trust. And her parents would somehow hear about it and call me to check in, which really meant lecture me about healthy relationship dynamics. I started keeping my mouth shut, telling myself it was just until the wedding. That once we were married, things would naturally shift, and Noah would fade into the background. I was wrong. 3 months before the wedding, we had a dinner scheduled with both families at this expensive restaurant in Midtown, one of those places with cloth napkins and a wine list thicker than a phone book. We were supposed to finalize the wedding details. Chloe had made the reservation, insisted on inviting her parents. I brought mine, figuring it was only fair. We were going to go over the seating chart, the timeline, the final head count, all the little details that needed deciding. I was actually feeling optimistic that night, thinking we were finally moving forward. I should have known something was off when we arrived and there was an extra chair at our table. My mom, Susan, noticed it first. She's observant like that. After we'd ordered, and the waiter had brought the wine, she asked in this perfectly polite voice, "Chloe, honey, why is Noah seated at the family table?" The temperature in that room dropped about 40 degrees. I swear I could feel it. Chloe's face went hard in a way I'd only seen a few times before. She looked at my mom like she'd just said something unforgivably rude, and snapped back that Noah was family, and she would think that would be obvious by now. I jumped in, trying to smooth things over, said something diplomatic about how we just didn't know he was coming tonight. And that's when Chloe's parents joined in. Brenda leaned forward with this condescending smile and told me we'd talked about this before, that my resistance to Noah was really about my own rigid thinking. Arthur added that it was a common pattern they saw all the time in couples therapy, this fear of your partner having connections outside the relationship. I felt my face get hot, not from anger, but from humiliation. Because they were doing it again. Turning my completely reasonable boundary into a psychological defect, and doing it in front of my parents. My mom's hand tightened around her fork, and my dad put his hand on her arm, a silent message to stay quiet. And I realized they'd been watching this happen for months, staying silent because I'd asked them not to interfere. Chloe was on a roll now. She started talking louder, saying things about how my family was stuck in the past and unable to accept modern relationship dynamics. I watched my mom's face crumble just a little bit, and something in me snapped. Not in a loud way, not in a dramatic way, but in this quiet, final way where I just knew I was done. Then Chloe stood up. I mean, she fully stood up from the table, so everyone in the restaurant could hear her. And she said, "Noah will be at our wedding. He'll be at our holidays. He'll be at our children's events. And if you can't accept that, Michael, then you shouldn't marry me." The whole restaurant went quiet. I could feel people staring. The waiter had frozen halfway through opening a bottle of wine at the next table. Chloe was looking at me with this expression that was half challenge and half certainty that I'd back down. Her parents were nodding, like she'd just said something profound. My parents were staring at their plates. And I felt this weird calm wash over me. I stood up slowly, pushed my chair back, and said in the most level voice I could manage, "You're right. I shouldn't marry you. So I won't." Then I looked at my parents and told them we were leaving. We walked out of that restaurant while Chloe was still standing there with her mouth open. We didn't say anything until we got to the parking lot. Then my mom just hugged me, and my dad said, "We're proud of you, son." And I realized that 5 years had just ended in one sentence, and all I felt was relief. The next morning, I woke up in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house. For the first time in a year, I didn't have that knot in my stomach, wondering what boundary I'd be expected to ignore that day. My phone had been going off since midnight. Dozens of calls and texts from Chloe, her parents, even some of her friends who'd apparently heard what happened and wanted to tell me I was making a huge mistake. I didn't answer any of them. I just turned off my phone and went downstairs where my mom had coffee waiting and my dad was reading the newspaper, like it was any other morning. They didn't ask if I was okay, or if I wanted to talk about it. They just let me sit there in silence. And that's exactly what I needed. By noon, my phone had over 60 messages. When I finally turned it back on and scrolled through them, I realized Chloe genuinely didn't understand what she'd done wrong. Her text started with confusion, asking why I'd embarrassed her like that in front of everyone. Then moved to anger, saying I'd humiliated her family and made a scene over nothing. And finally landed on this weird mix of therapy speak and accusations, telling me I was sabotaging our relationship because I was afraid of commitment. Brenda sent me a long message about how I was displaying avoidant attachment behaviors and should really consider individual counseling before making any permanent decisions. Arthur sent something shorter, but equally condescending, about how walking away from conflict was emotionally immature. Not one of them acknowledged that maybe, just maybe, giving me an ultimatum in front of both our families about her ex-boyfriend being a permanent fixture in our marriage was the actual problem. I didn't respond to any of it. I just started making calls about the wedding. The venue was the first. When I explained I needed to cancel, the coordinator got really quiet and then asked if I was sure, because we'd lose the entire deposit. I told her I was sure, and to send the bill to Chloe's parents, since they'd insisted on paying for the venue as their gift. Then I called the caterer, the florist, the DJ, the photographer, and went down the entire list, methodically canceling everything. Some were sympathetic, some were annoyed about the late notice. But I didn't care anymore. I just wanted it done. The photographer actually thanked me for calling so early because she just had another booking request for that date. And I remember thinking, that's good. At least someone's day will work out. My best friend, Sam, called me that afternoon. He'd been my best man and had apparently heard through the grapevine what happened. He asked if I needed him to come over. I said no, but he showed up anyway with beer and pizza, and we sat in my parents' backyard, not really talking about it, but just existing in the same space. He told me he'd never liked Chloe's family, thought they were pretentious and condescending. He'd always wondered why Noah was around so much, but figured it wasn't his place to say anything. I asked him why nobody had said anything, and he just shrugged and said, "Would you have listened a year ago?" He was right. I wouldn't have. I'd been so deep in the fog of wanting to be the perfect, progressive boyfriend that I'd ignored every red flag, every gut feeling telling me something was wrong. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Chloe showed up at my house. I'd gone back to collect some things and make sure everything was secure. She was sitting on the front steps, waiting for me. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept. When she saw me, she immediately started crying and saying we needed to talk. I told her there was nothing to talk about, but she followed me inside anyway. And that's when I showed her the folder I'd prepared. Inside were copies of the deed to the house, showing it was solely in my name, purchased 2 years before we met. And a timeline I'd written out of when she'd moved in, and what the living arrangement had been. She stared at the papers, confused, and asked what this was about. I explained calmly that since we weren't getting married, she needed to move out. I was giving her 30 days to find a new place. She looked at me like I'd slapped her and said, "You're kicking me out?" I corrected her. I wasn't kicking her out. I was simply ending our cohabitation now that we were no longer engaged. She tried to argue that she'd lived here for 3 years, that she had rights. And I pulled out another paper, showing the housing agreement we'd signed when she moved in, the one her lawyer dad had insisted on, actually, which clearly stated the house was mine, and she was essentially a guest. The irony wasn't lost on me. Her father's paranoia about protecting her assets had actually protected mine. Chloe completely fell apart then, dropping onto the couch and sobbing, saying she didn't understand how we got here and couldn't we just talk about this like adults. I sat down across from her, not next to her, and asked her a simple question: did she actually want to marry me, or did she want to marry the idea of having both me and Noah in her life forever? She got defensive immediately. Said I was twisting things, and that Noah was just a friend, and she couldn't believe I was this insecure. I didn't raise my voice. I just repeated the question. And she couldn't answer it. The silence stretched out for almost a minute, and then she said something that made everything click into place. She said, "Noah wanted to get back together last year, and I said no because I was with you. Doesn't that count for anything?" I just stared at her, processing what she'd just admitted, and asked why Noah would think he had a chance if they were just friends. She started backtracking immediately, saying it wasn't like that, he just expressed feelings and she'd shut it down. But I could see the truth in her face. She'd liked the attention. Liked having two men competing for her. Liked being the center of that dynamic. And she convinced herself, and everyone around her, that this was normal and healthy, and I was the broken one for objecting. I stood up and told her she had until the end of the month to move out, and if she needed help finding a place, I'd be happy to give her recommendations for apartments near her parents'. She started yelling then, saying I was being cruel and heartless and throwing away 5 years like it meant nothing. I let her yell until she ran out of steam. Then I said quietly, "Chloe, you gave me an ultimatum. You told me not to marry you if I couldn't accept Noah being at every major event for the rest of our lives. And I took option 2. This isn't me throwing anything away. This is me respecting your boundary." She didn't have a response to that. She just grabbed her purse and left, slamming the door hard enough that I heard something rattle in the kitchen. I stood there in my living room, in my house, in the space I'd worked so hard to build, and felt nothing but relief that she was gone. Over the next 3 weeks, Chloe moved her stuff out gradually, usually when I wasn't home. Her friends helped her, because I guess she was too embarrassed to ask her parents. She left her key on the kitchen counter with a note that just said, "I hope you're happy." And I remember reading it and thinking, yes, actually I am. The remaining weeks before what would have been the wedding date passed quietly, almost surreally peaceful. I used that time to focus on work, spend time with my parents, and process everything without the constant noise of Chloe's drama. My mom called me every few days to check in, never pushy, just making sure I was eating and sleeping and not spiraling. And I appreciated that she trusted me to handle this my own way. My dad sent me a text one night that just said, "Proud of you for knowing your worth." I saved that message, because it meant more than he probably knew. Chloe's parents tried calling me once, together on speakerphone. I let it go to voicemail, where Brenda left this long, rambling message about how they were disappointed in my inability to work through relationship challenges, and they hoped I'd eventually grow enough to understand what I'd lost. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. I'd heard enough of their analysis to last me a lifetime. The wedding date came and went. I spent it at a drafting table in my home office, working on designs for a new project, completely at peace with my decision. My friends took me out that night, not because I was sad, but because they wanted to celebrate me finally standing up for myself. We ended up at a bar, telling stories and laughing until late. Ethan's girlfriend brought her friend, Lauren, and we talked about architecture and art and travel. Normal things, easy things. And at no point did she mention her ex-boyfriend, or make me feel like I was crazy for having boundaries. It was refreshing in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Just a simple conversation with someone who respected themselves and others enough not to play games. When I got home that night, I looked around my house, really looked at it, and realized I could finally breathe again. The space felt like mine again, not like a stage where I had to perform being okay with something I wasn't okay with. And I knew walking away had been the right choice. 6 months after the breakup, I was standing in the lobby of a boutique hotel in Lisbon, looking at gorgeous sketches on the wall, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd thought about Chloe. I'd taken 3 weeks off work, my first real vacation in years, and spent it traveling through Italy and Greece, looking at architecture, visiting museums, eating at small local restaurants, just existing without anyone questioning my boundaries or analyzing my emotional state. It was the first time since the engagement that I felt like myself again. Not the version of me that was constantly trying to prove I was secure and evolved. Just Michael, architect guy who likes buildings and good coffee and not having his ex-girlfriend's ex-boyfriend at family dinners. When I got back home, my boss pulled me into his office and told me I looked different, more relaxed. Then he offered me lead on a major commercial project downtown that I'd been hoping to get for 2 years. The project was a mixed-use development, retail and residential. Exactly the kind of challenge I loved. I threw myself into it completely. The work was demanding but satisfying. Late nights at the drafting table, meetings with contractors and city planners, site visits where I could see the design coming to life in real space and real materials. My team was great, enthusiastic, and talented. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually building something instead of just managing someone else's emotional chaos. About 2 months into the project, a professional architecture journal reached out, wanting to feature our work in their spring issue. When the article came out, with my name as lead architect and photos of the preliminary designs, my parents framed it and hung it in their living room. My mom called me, crying happy tears. My dad sent me a text that just said, "Always knew you had it in you." And I felt this deep sense of pride that had nothing to do with anyone else's validation. I'd proven to myself that I could walk away from something that wasn't right and build something better, both literally and metaphorically. I ran into Chloe about 10 months after the breakup, completely by accident at a coffee shop near my office. I was picking up my usual order, not paying attention, and turned around, almost crashing right into her. She looked different, thinner maybe, and her hair was shorter. For a second, we just stared at each other with that awkward recognition of people who used to share a life. She said hi first. Asked how I was doing. I said fine. Asked her the same. She told me she was living with her parents temporarily while she looked for a place, and I nodded politely. Then she asked if I was seeing anyone. I told her I'd been on a few dates, but nothing serious, which was true. I'd matched with a few women on apps and had pleasant enough evenings, but I wasn't rushing into anything. She looked like she wanted to say more. Opened her mouth and closed it a few times, and finally asked if we could talk sometime, really talk. I thought about it for a second, and then said honestly that I didn't think there was anything left to talk about. We both made our choices and moved on, and I hoped she was doing well, but I didn't see the point in rehashing the past. She nodded slowly, eyes getting watery, and said she understood. And then she left. I watched her walk out and waited for some feeling to hit. Sadness, or regret, or even anger. But there was nothing. Just a mild sense of that was awkward and relief when she was gone. The complete absence of emotion told me everything I needed to know about whether ending things had been the right call. A few weeks after that, I started seeing someone new, not from the apps, but through a friend of a friend at a gallery opening. Her name was Lauren. She was a structural engineer, and the first time we talked she spent 20 minutes passionately explaining why cantilever design was underutilized in residential architecture, and I was completely charmed. She was direct and honest and didn't play games. If she wanted to see me, she said so. If she needed space, she said that too. And the simplicity of it was almost shocking after years of trying to decode Chloe's therapy language. Lauren met my parents after about 2 months, and my mom pulled me aside later and whispered, "I like this one. She's straightforward." I realized that was exactly what had been missing before. On what would have been my first wedding anniversary, I was at a construction site, looking at foundation work for the project, hard hat on, blueprints in hand, talking through drainage solutions with the site manager. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder I'd forgotten to delete, wedding anniversary. I dismissed it without a second thought. That evening, Lauren came over and cooked dinner at my place. We ate on the couch, watching a documentary about Japanese architecture. At some point, she fell asleep with her head on my shoulder. And I just sat there, thinking about how easy this felt. No drama, no triangulation, no one making me feel crazy for wanting a normal relationship. Just two people who liked each other and respected each other, building something together at their own pace. I never heard from Noah. Never saw him around town. And honestly, didn't care where he ended up or whether he and Chloe finally got together like they probably both wanted all along. That part of my life was closed. A chapter I'd finished and shelved, and I had no interest in reopening it. My friends stopped asking if I was okay, or if I regretted my decision. They could see I was genuinely better, happier, more present in my own life. Sam told me one night over drinks that watching me walk out of that restaurant was one of the most decisive things he'd ever seen. And I laughed and said it hadn't felt decisive in the moment, it had felt necessary. Looking back now, almost a year later, I can see that walking away wasn't giving up, or running from conflict, or any of the things Chloe's parents accused me of. It was choosing myself, and my boundaries, and my right to a relationship where I didn't come in third place behind my partner and her ex. I built a good life after that dinner. A life that feels solid and real and mine. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. Not even the fantasy version of what Chloe and I might have been, if she'd been willing to actually choose me. Some people called me cold for how quickly I moved on, but they didn't see the year of slow erosion before that. The constant gaslighting and boundary violations that had already killed what we had. By the time I walked out of that restaurant, I'd already done my grieving. I'd already tried everything I could think of to make it work. And all that was left was the final acknowledgement that it never would. Do you think there's ever a right way to walk away from a relationship that's fundamentally broken?